Today, we're breaking down 6 players that I cannot stop drafting in 2025 fantasy football drafts. These are the players that I am refusing to leave my drafts without. Let's start the video with Chase Brown of the Cincinnati Bengals, a player that I've been talking about a lot throughout the course of the offseason. I think Chase Brown is one of the best overall values when we're looking at the third round currently of 2025 fantasy football drafts, currently sitting at an ADP of 31.6 on the sleeper app. Look back to 2024 fantasy football. We got a few very solid games out of Chase Brown before the Zach Moss injury. In week 8, week 4, 23.2 fantasy points, week 5, 16.4 fantasy points, week 6, 14.4 fantasy points. But then we look between weeks 9 and 17 last year when Zach Moss was not in the starting lineup for the Cincinnati Bengals, double-digit fantasy performances in every single game for Chase Brown. He had 19 or more fantasy points in 6 out of 8 of those games. 3 or more catches in every single game. Very involved in that passing attack. He was the number 6 running back last year in overall targets with 4.1 targets per game. Number 5 amongst all running backs in receptions with 3.4 receptions per game. And he was the RB15 in total routes ran. So you have this worry that, once again, this is a throw-first offense. That doesn't matter. That's a good thing for Chase Brown. He is very heavily involved in the passing attack for the Bengals. Once again, looking back to last year, even with Zach Moss in the starting lineup for the first 8 weeks of the season, Chase Brown was still the RB14 in fantasy points per game with 15.9 fantasy points per game. Now we go into 2025, and Chase Brown is the undisputed RB1 for the Bengals. That neck injury to Zach Moss really concerns me. And listen, I know that Tajay Brooks, the rookie out of Texas Tech, is making some flashes in training camp and definitely a player to monitor. But even if we see some additional touches to another running back in this backfield, I'm not worried about it. We're going into 2025 with Chase Brown as the undisputed RB1 for the Bengals. He was the RB10 in 2024 without being the lead back for the Bengals for half of the season. This year, he's going to be the lead back for the entirety of the 2025 fantasy football season. His value is ridiculous in fantasy drafts. We've got the same exact offensive look for 2025 for the Bengals. Burrow, Chase, Higgins, Gesicki at tight end, Chase Brown right there in this lineup. Same offensive line, same poor defense, same offensive coordinator and head coach. This Bengals team is going to be looking very similar to what they were last year. Chase Brown's going to be a huge part of this offensive attack. I think he's one of the best overall values when it comes to the running back position for 2025 fantasy football. So let's take a look at Jackson Smith-Njigba of the Seattle Seahawks, who was honestly a player who I feel like his ADP has been shifting throughout the course of the offseason, and I see him drafted at a lot of different areas in 2025 drafts and 2025 fantasy football mock drafts, but he is currently sitting at an ADP of 26.5 on the sleeper app. And he goes into 2025, finishing that sophomore campaign overall as the wide receiver 9 in full PPR, number 6 in routes ran, number 12 in total targets, number 7 in receptions, number 10 in receiving yards, number 7 in yards after catch, number 7 in total juke rate, and number 17 in fantasy points per game. And ultimately, now he's going into the season with a little bit less competition at the wide receiver position. No DK Metcalf, no Tyler Lockett. I know Cooper Kupp is now on this team, and I do think, truthfully, Cooper Kupp will have some sort of role. I don't think he's 100% washed. Got some buzz out of players like Torrey Horton, Jake Bobo, MVS is on this roster. There are other pass catchers on this team, and ultimately Clint Kubiak coming in as offensive coordinator. I've talked about this a lot. It's going to be very good for Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet. This will be a run-first offense, but ultimately, at the end of the day, the number 1 undisputed target in the passing attack is going to be JSN. I think he's just a really good value. I see him fall a lot against his current ADP in a lot of drafts and mock drafts, and I think ultimately he's going to be a monster target hog in 2025 fantasy football. And Sam Darnold, I think, is in a position to really support JSN in his 3rd season in the league and potentially give him an even higher of a breakout season in 2025. 2025. I don't think there's any reason why, at worst, JSN finishes as a top 15 wide receiver, but I do think that the ceiling is higher than the wide receiver 9 that we saw last year. So I think he's being a bit undervalued in drafts right now. Don't forget, Sam Darnold was able to support both Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison at the wide receiver position last year. JSN is in line for a monster amount of volume in 2025, and he's a player that I just find myself, especially when he's falling against ADP, drafting time and time over and over again. All right, next up is a player that I feel like I talk about every single offseason. That is Devonta Smith of the Philadelphia Eagles, currently sitting at an ADP of 53.6 on Sleeper. This is after finishing as the wide receiver 27 last year, playing through just 13 games. We have to remember that, but still finished as the wide receiver 15 in fantasy points per game in full PPR. Was a wide receiver 19 in 2023, was the wide receiver 9 in 2022. And once again, we look back to last year, we still only had single-digit fantasy performances out of Devonta Smith 3 times. Every other game, double-digit fantasy performances. He was super solid through the fantasy playoffs. He was a league winner last year, scoring 30 fantasy points in week 17. And I just always find myself talking about Devonta Smith each and every offseason. He is just a true model of consistency in fantasy football, the perfect flex option for you guys to go out and draft. 7 or more receiving touchdowns in 3 straight seasons, 1,000 or more receiving yards in 2 out of the last 3 years. If he had played in 15, 16 games last year, he could have easily hit that number. He had 833 receiving yards through 13 games last year, and he's been the wide receiver 20 or better in fantasy points per game in 3 straight seasons. So some people would argue here, you're looking at more of a floor for Devonta Smith, and I think that's fair to a degree, but we also see a lot of those high ceilings throughout the season. You look back the last 3 games last year, 28 points in week 15, 11.1 in week 16, but then once again, 30 in week 17. He has the ability to have those really big games, has a great chemistry with Jalen Hurts. And then once again, AJ Brown's on the field. He is taking the number 1 overall defensive pressure, opens up a lot of those big plays for Devonta Smith. I know some people kind of point here and say, well, the Eagles are a run-first offense, and sure, they very could well be in 2025 again with Saquon Barkley and Jalen Hurts at the quarterback position. But once again, they're kind of in line for some regression in terms of how often they run the football, because they ran the football a ridiculous amount in 2024. This has been one of my arguments for both A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith moving into 2025, because Saquon Barkley had 345 rushing attempts. Absolutely absurd in 2024. And then even Jalen Hurts had 150 rushing attempts himself at the quarterback position. So you can definitely expect for some regression in those numbers and for the passing attack to be a little bit more fluent in 2025. And once again, Devonta Smith and A.J. Brown both missed some time last year. Can expect them to go into the season fully healthy. So when you're in those mid rounds, looking for a wide receiver 2 potentially, but especially when you're looking for that flex fill in bench wide receiver, Devonta Smith is a player that you cannot leave your 2025 fantasy football drafts with. He offers way too much consistency and once again a very solid ceiling as we approach 2025. Fantasy football. All right, next up, I apologize if it feels like I'm beating a dead horse here, but I am talking about Jordan Addison again. This is absolutely a player that I am refusing to leave fantasy drafts without, that I am drafting over and over throughout the course of this offseason. Yes, I understand that Jordan Addison could miss some time going into 2025 as he's dealing with the off-the-field issues and everything, but it looks like it's not going to be a large suspension for Jordan Addison if he is suspended going into 2025. And he actually has moved back in ADP compared to what's on the screen there. I have 70.3, but since I have started recording this video, he's moved back to the ADP of 71.4 on the Sleeper app. He's a player right now who, due to the off-the-field stuff, his ADP is shifting a little bit. But I think that's a positive thing because he's already been a great value, even if he's to miss 2 to 4 games at that ADP. And if his ADP continues to slide a little bit, continues to be a phenomenal value. Jordan Addison only played in 15 games last year, missed 2 games. So if he gets a 2-game suspension, we're not really looking at different numbers. And he was the wide receiver 21 last year in full PPR, the wide receiver 22 in fantasy points per game with 14.2 fantasy points per game. And in his rookie season, he was the wide receiver 23. He has finished as a wide receiver, in the top 25 wide receivers 2 straight seasons, and was the wide receiver 30 in fantasy points per game with 13 fantasy points per game in his rookie season. Has had 9 or more receiving touchdowns in 2 straight seasons. Overall, last year, very productive, even with missing those 2 games, right? Number 10 in red zone targets, number 5 amongst all wide receivers in receiving touchdowns, number 11 in deep targets. So, a lot of people look at Addison as just like a red zone type guy, but no, he gets those deep targets. He gets those plays involved where he stretches the field. Number 12 in contested catch rate, and still finish top 36 in targets, receiving yards, air yards, receptions, and fantasy points per game amongst all wide receivers. Like I said, has had 13 or more fantasy points per game in 2 straight seasons. We look at the Vikings last year, number 12 in total offense, 4,300 passing yards with Sam Darnold at quarterback. Wes Phillips back as the offensive coordinator. This Kevin O'Connell system is made to throw the football first and foremost. If Sam Darnold can support both JJ and Jordan Addison, nobody should be worried about JJ McCarthy, who's looked very good throughout training camp. And most importantly, has had a very good chemistry with Jordan Addison, especially with Justin Jefferson currently dealing with a hamstring injury. So overall, Addison in line for a lot of volume this year, is a great flex player for you guys. And I think he's being really undervalued currently in 2025 fantasy football drafts. Make sure you guys are not leaving your drafts without him, because I absolutely am not. All right, and maybe I'm still beating a dead horse here, but we're also going to talk about DeAndre Swift, because I think the main thing with DeAndre Swift, who's currently sitting at an ADP of 76.4 on the Sleeper app, the main thing here for me is it really doesn't feel like we've seen a huge shift in ADP for DeAndre Swift over the past couple of weeks. And honestly, that surprises me. And I've talked about DeAndre Swift throughout the course of the offseason, but he's been the RB21 or better in 3 straight seasons, the RB19 last year with 12.6 fantasy points per game, and a very, very just not impressive offense overall. But we're all expecting this offense to be much better in 2025 with Caleb Williams in his sophomore season under head coach Ben Johnson, who we know has been an incredible offensive coordinator for the past few seasons with the Lions. And we look at Swift, he's averaged 12.5 or more fantasy points per game in 3 straight seasons. Last year, he was still number 10 in total carries, number 10 in total receiving yards, number 14 in receptions, number 8 in routes ran. So he only had double digits in 7 games last year, and we would have definitely liked to see those numbers be higher with how much opportunity he was getting in the offense last year. But we also saw a lot of red zone touches and touchdowns vultured from DeAndre Swift. I don't get the sense that we're going to see that in 2025. Now, the Bears have brought in offensive coordinator Declan Doyle, who we don't have like a huge history of. This is just who Ben Johnson went out and selected, was formerly with the Broncos. But at the end of the day, this is the Ben Johnson system, and we're expecting Swift to be at the front and center of that, because they didn't go out and spend high draft capital on a running back or bring in another running back in free agency. And ultimately, this is going to be DeAndre Swift's backfield in 2025. We looked at this Ben Johnson system in 2024 alone. David Montgomery, Jahmyr Gibbs combined for 32 total touchdowns. The volume will absolutely be there. And as we've said 100 times, right, this offensive line, at least on paper, has improved through free agency in this past year. And they were still better at run blocking last year compared to pass blocking ultimately, but they're going to be much better at run blocking this year, especially bringing in Drew Dalman, the center from the Falcons. But they've gone out and they brought in guards, tackles as well, and they've brought in offensive linemen through the NFL draft the past 2 seasons as well. So all signs are pointing towards a very positive season for DeAndre Swift. And at worst, once again, the ADP here, you're not spending high draft capital on Swift. So you can go out and draft him. The floor is very safe. Once again, over the past 3 seasons, he's at 12.5 or more fantasy points per game. You're getting that floor for your RB3, for your RB4, but there's a lot of reason to believe that the ceiling will be higher for Swift in 2025. So I'm going to continue smashing the draft button on him in those later rounds at the running back position. I absolutely think that you guys should as well. All right, the last player that I want to talk about is Stefon Diggs of the New England Patriots. currently sitting on an ADP of 91.6 on the Sleeper app. And this is a player that I've kind of warmed up to over the past couple weeks in terms of drafting. I was taking some shares here and there, but the concern here with Stefon Diggs is obviously age 31, but also coming off of that ACL tear he suffered in October 2024, right? But so far in training camp, he's been lighting it up, has good chemistry with sophomore quarterback Drake May, and he looks like he is full send, ready to go into the 2025 season with no limitations. And we have to remember, this is still a player who averaged 15.2 fantasy points per game in 2024 through 8 games and gave you double-digit fantasy performances in every game last year except for 2. If he had played a fully healthy season last year, he would have been on a great pace overall, even when Nico Collins came back into the mix for the Texans. So ultimately, the other thing here is you're getting the wide receiver 1 for the Patriots straight up. Wide receiver 1 on any offense is always going to have some sort of value. And while there are guys kind of in these later rounds, like a Chris Olave or a Jerry Jeudy, who feel a little bit less valuable because they have questionable quarterback play, there's so much hype around Drake May, a better offensive line going into 2025. We've heard so many people in the fantasy community be high on Drake May, and it's just the general NFL community be high on Drake May. And we're getting Drake May's number 1 target for the 2025 season at an ADP of 91.6. We've seen some buzz about, Demario Douglas, people like Kyle Williams, the rookie wide receiver, getting, some talk about Kayshon Boutte in the past couple of weeks as well, in terms of guys that are still lining up in the number 1's overall offense and are doing things in training camp. And I'm sure all those guys can have some sort of role here, but in terms of the true bona fide number 1 wide receiver on this team, is going to be Stefon Diggs as long as he's healthy. And once again, this is a player that you're drafting very late. So, if you're worried about the age or, the concerns over injury from last year, you're not spending high draft capital. So you can go out and draft him, and you might be landing a very solid wide receiver for the entirety of 2025. And if something happens here, well, you didn't spend high draft capital. So the risk reward is at a very good ratio here. So I'm currently finding myself drafting a lot of Stefon Diggs, and I actually think his ADP could move up over the next couple weeks as we get into the month of August. But for now, I'm smashing the draft button on Stefon Diggs. I think you guys should be as well. That'll do it for today's video. There are 6 players that I'm refusing to leave my 2025 fantasy drafts without. If you guys did enjoy the video today, be sure to subscribe on the way out. If you're into fantasy football content, this is all we do all year long. Free fantasy football content, redraft, dynasty, and best ball. More importantly, if you guys have any fantasy football questions whatsoever, make sure to drop them down below. I'll get back to you guys when I can. If you guys want to check out any of our other 2025 fantasy football content to help you guys get ready for the upcoming season and dominate it, it'll be popping up on the screen somewhere on these playlists. Go check out what we've put together so far this off season. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.